I'll share them another time.
Thank you, Laura.
You're welcome, and
Family, wonderful. And in the words, there were some key adaptations. And that really relates with my talk today as well. It's a great segue. We're going to be talking about the evolving journey of faith is my theme today. And I want to start out by just opening up this conversation, which I kind of brought in through the meditation, that we have this, and maybe in the last decades, this new creation story that has emerged. It's sometimes called the common creation story of the evolution of life on Earth, including the human evolutionary journey, which is very dynamic. There's been a huge amount of change for humans from, let's say, our species first emerging 300,000 years ago in Africa, 50, 60,000 years ago, people really going on this migration, Homo sapiens out of Africa throughout the rest of the continents. Only 12,000 years ago, developing herding and agriculture and the framework for complex societies to emerge, more complex. And then, within that journey, we have religion and faith playing a very creative and dynamic role with, some of the oldest, the oldest religions maybe in existence would be the Aboriginal religions in Australia, maybe 40,000 years old. And then, another layer would be more like Hinduism. It's very old, like maybe over 5,000 years, and Judaism, very old religions. But there's a ton of dynamism, because if you look at 300,000 years of human journeying, the forms of spirituality we have now only cover a fraction of that time, and they are also rapidly evolving just as our whole society is. We're all aware, I think, of the speed and the rapidity of change in our world, and that's part of what changes also our spiritual lives and the dynamic there. And I'll just take a second to just talk a little bit about how kind of like faith and society are in this very interesting dynamic, because there's so many different parts. And when one part moves, another part moves. So for example, it's really within, in the Western world, the religious imagination produced some really powerful ideas like equality and the idea of every person having a sacred value, every person being made in the image of God, that metaphor. And the Hebrew prophets, for example, in the Bible talked about world peace, international harmony, these huge ideas that then began to shape human consciousness and call forth changes in society. Now, on the other hand, then you have changes in society changing faiths as well. So you have, for example, when we're developing an awareness, for example, of the problem of racism and understanding how that works in humanity, then you get out of that a critique of religions. Because if you're saying, hey, it's wrong to say you shouldn't allow people of different races to marry, well, then what about religions doing that? So then you get a critique. And you say, what about faithism and religion? How is that dividing us? How is that a problem? But you wouldn't have seen it without the change in society. That's just one example. Another one would be how we're getting, a critique now as we have this sense of international solidarity growing, this vision, the UN, international cooperation. Then you get a sharper critique of nationalism, xenophobia. We're like, look, nationalism led to the world wars. It's a big problem. Then that feeds back. You get a critique of kind of religious exclusivism and how it feeds into nationalism, and how Then you get a critique of empires, like colonialism is terrible. Colonialism has caused so much destruction. And you're like, well, religions have been colonial. They've done that. So these critiques kind of feed back and forth as we're in this dynamic process of change. For example, the critique of religious colonialism that has also destroyed, Christianity, for example, as a globalizing religion that really disrespected indigenous traditions and destroyed them in many cases. So then once you get that critique and you understand that that's wrong, then you're able to say, well, let's now have respect. Let's recover indigenous perspectives. Let's recover earth-based traditions that were previously judged as inferior, but that was just part of racism and part of colonialism. So these are some of the ways that there's this dynamic. Just to kind of lay out some of these ideas. Another huge one in our time now is really the growth of scientific understanding of reality and the growth of secular culture. And, this space that has opened up an even sharper kind of critique to be like, well, we don't need religion at all. We have plenty of other ways to make meaning. Now there's also then creative interplay, like people saying, well, let's study Buddhism from a scientific perspective and see what happens with meditation. Oh, it's good for your brain. It's good for your focus. Okay. So then you bring you bring that analytical lens and you're wanting to say, well, what are the impacts? Maybe it's good for people to belong in a community. Maybe it helps them. So that's bringing another lens. And just this one insight that I've been using as I look at religion, theology, I've also been remembering that everything has a beginning and an end. And no religious form is permanent. It's started at some time, it will end at some time, most likely given our species journey as humans. We'll be a human species longer than any religion we've got now, even though, this is important too, religions are the most durable cultural forms in existence, much more so than nations or even languages and so forth. So these are just some of the ideas in my mind as I'm kind of opening up a little bit of a brainstorm here. Now I want to move into kind of looking at this on a personal level, because there's a lot that we can learn about this dynamic, evolving journey of faith by looking at our own experiences of how we have related to our religions of origin, to different paths we've trod, to different types of spiritual practice that we have journeyed with in our lives. Alan Cantor was speaking last week and he talked about embracing this flow of change fearlessly and alive. And he gave a great example of this inner voice that guided him to take on cycling, which became a spiritual practice in his life, which became a social thing, which became a charitable thing, which became just like a life transforming practice because he listened to an inner guidance that said, try this. So I think listening to that voice within us is really an indispensable source of guidance for our own paths, and we can kind of see how we've been guided throughout our lives, even in like the very fine details in terms of kind of like what book to read next. There's some intuitive guidance. Okay, what book am I reading next? What practice am I going to explore? Who can I trust? Who can I surround myself with to support my inner growth? Maybe even like, where am I being led to be part of some kind of community of people who could support me in my life, in this journey? Many years ago, we took on the name of Spiritual Center as we're in this very dynamic process. I'm going to get to that. It was very much in reference to this source of inspiration and guidance within. That was kind of the pun of spiritual center. Center as a building that people kind of understand that, but then center as an inner experience. And that has been a big part of our journey to stay alive and aware to what is within each of us, and to make that a topic of our conversation, a topic of how we come together and what guides our steps. So that's kind of personal, deeply personal. Each of us has a journey that's unique. And then when we look at it from a community perspective, looking at the spiritual center community, I have been really seeing that we have this task in an intergenerational sense. As kind of a community, I see us very much as having an intergenerational role in this dynamic process of spiritual evolution, kind of this journey of meaning making. I feel like if we want to have a positive impact on the world, we must be guided by a vision for future generations and a sense of interconnection with them. And we get that by trying to cultivate a multi-generational community that's like wanting to have this kind of positive impact. In the vision of Hippolyte, who's this peacemaker, Rwandan peacemaker, who has been a big source of inspiration for community, he talks about his mission being halting the intergenerational transmission of hate. After surviving the genocide in Rwanda, he really realized the only way to really change this is on an intergenerational level. The rising generation needs to be taught to love, taught inclusion, taught not to hate. And that brings me to this question of, positively speaking, what are we trying to transmit? What are we trying to transmit in this journey of humanity? We're here in this moment. What are we sending forward into the future? Because it seems to me that that's kind of like our leverage point for highest impact, and really our point of agency. If you like see this whole process, we're here, and what we do affects the entire future. It's really an important responsibility. And what are we doing with our influence? And why are we here? In what are we as a link in this chain? Are we going to pass down hate? We definitely don't want to. We would want to pass down love in that case. But there's other more qualitative aspects to what we're really trying to do. And I'm asking that question today. I'm wondering, like, can we create a space where the generations that are rising up can find a sense of belonging and engage in the kind of what some scholars call this creative ritual play, this play of meaning making. Later, we'll have time for discussion, Donna. This time of meaning making and space to discover who they are and draw on inner resources and cultivate a vision for our world. So I just wanted to honor that we're at a very dynamic place, and our community is exceptionally dynamic in the scene of faith, spirituality, religious life. Here's one example. I was inspired to go down to the physical building and take pictures of key symbols in the sanctuary. See, this one represents, this is, in 2012, what we now call Common Street Spiritual Center was the First Baptist Church in Natick, and it was closed. And the founders, this is one of the symbols that was in the sanctuary from the previous generation. And you can see they have an image of Jesus with children. And I think there is this sense of wanting to pass down faith to the future. They had the courage to realize that their model of Christianity wasn't working and that they were going to let it go and hand it off to a new generation to build a different kind of spiritual community. Actually, it takes a lot of courage to do that. So then you'll see on the other side of the sanctuary, this was the symbol that we first early commissioned in our life as a community by a local artist, Virginia Fitzgerald. We asked her for a peace dove, and she gave us a peace dove nested in a tree of life. See, here it is closer. So much going on here with the many different creatures within that tree. You see things like these little houses. Faintly, you can see them in the wings, kind of the sacredness of community, the sacredness of all life, a celebration of diversity, and this guiding value of peace. I looked a little bit more. There are also these windows that are supposed to represent the Holy Spirit in rainbow colors, which are really beautiful. And creatively, I'm saying, is there some bridge of spirit from the symbology of, the First Baptist Church there, bridging into, our new symbology of the peace stuff. I hope this is too complicated to look at. But I just show that to illustrate that we as a community have been in a process of adaptive change, really moving from one point to another. And, part of the ideas that I drew to kind of guide us forward were from Howard Thurman, who in the 50s started the first interracial church, and it also became interfaith. And that was a real guiding light, but even Thurman couldn't have predicted, for example, this moment that we're in now, about 70 years later, where traditional religions, especially Christianity in the US, is losing so much for participation from generation to generation. We're really in a state of change where, for example, those who would identify as having no religion in the last decade alone have increased by 30 million people in the US. That's an incredible demographic change. When you look at the younger generations rising up, like Millennial, Gen Z, they have a much more open sense, and they're much less inclined to be religiously defined. They're much more in a wide open journey on this front. So that's part of where we find ourselves as a community in this dynamic process. And there are many other themes, and this has to be part one on this topic, but really this move to trusting inner guidance rather than outer authority, that's part of it. The theme of interconnection rather than individualistic faith. As much as people don't want to have maybe a dogmatic religion, they're also more focused on this world mattering, healing in the here and now, healing for the immediate future generations, restoring balance to the planet, solving some of the very pressing crises like discrimination and poverty. But there's still a desire for, even if people say there are none, but there's still a desire for inner work, deep inner work, connection, community, transformation. And so I'm a millennial, but I still don't know enough about this. I still only have a clue of what's going on. I have a hunch that as a community, a first step for us could be really deepening our trust as a community and making space for kind of each of our soul's journey to really exist and have room to breathe in the community. I think just opening space with trust and that acceptance and belonging, and allowing our processes to be shared, that allowing us to like share the insights from our personal journeys and share the dynamism of that, whether we've moved into religions, moved away from religions, gone in different paths, all of that is deeply meaningful. And I think through that sharing, we would become much more aware and present to this moment, this dynamic moment of time that we find ourselves in on what I would call this evolving journey of faith and humanity and spirituality and ethics. And the more present we could be together, the more intentional, and I think I'm hoping the more positive our outcome could be as we bring forward into the future, as we kind of transmit something of the essence of who we are and what we've learned on our journeys.